Sitting in a dusty transport covered in desert sand, receiving a text that you've been cut from a massive family estate stings worse than a bullet. Being treated like a disgrace for choosing boots over boardrooms was expected. What happened at the estate reading, however, absolutely nobody saw coming. Arthur Thomas built his fortune on steel, glass, and a ruthless disposition. The Thomas real estate empire dominated the Chicago skyline, a monument to a man who believed that vulnerability was a character flaw and power was the only currency that mattered. In our household, affection was not freely given. It was earned through compliance. You either contributed to the family legacy or you were a liability. My older sister Beatrice understood this perfectly. From the time she was a teenager, she molded herself into the perfect corporate heir. She attended the right Ivy League schools, married a wealthy corporate shark named Gregory Crawford, and spent her weekends rubbing elbows with politicians and board members at the country club. She was the golden child, draped in designer clothes and armed with a smile that could freeze water. Then there was me. At 18, I sat in my father's cavernous, oak-paneled study and told him I had declined my acceptance to Harvard Business School to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Arthur stared at me from across his mahogany desk, his jaw clenched tight. "You are a Thomas," he had growled, his voice vibrating with disdain. "We command industries. We build the future. We do not take orders from bureaucrats, and we certainly do not throw our lives away playing soldier in the mud. If you walk out that door, you do it without my blessing and without a dime of my money." I walked out. Over the next 12 years, I built a life far removed from the manicured lawns of the Thomas estate. I commissioned as an infantry officer, enduring the grueling conditions of Ranger School and multiple combat deployments to Afghanistan. Eventually, I was recruited into military intelligence, specializing in highly classified support for Tier 1 special operations. By the time I pinned on the rank of major, I was attached to the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, coordinating missions for units whose names didn't officially exist. To my family, however, I was just a low-level government employee. Due to the classified nature of my work, I couldn't tell them that I was directing airstrikes, dismantling terror cells, or leading intelligence operations alongside Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. Whenever Beatrice deigned to speak to me at mandatory holiday dinners, she would ask, in a tone dripping with condescension, if I was still filing paperwork for the Army. I never corrected her. It was easier to let them believe I was a failure than to explain a world they fundamentally lacked the capacity to understand. The fracture in our family became permanent when Arthur's health began to fail. I was deep in an undisclosed location in the Middle East, running tactical oversight on a high-value target extraction, when the Red Cross message finally reached my commanding officer. My father had suffered a massive stroke. By the time I secured emergency leave and made the brutal 30-hour journey back to Chicago, it was too late. Arthur Thomas had passed away. I arrived at the funeral straight from the airport, exhausted and running on adrenaline. I wore my Army Green Service uniform, my chest adorned with ribbons and badges, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Ranger tab that represented years of sacrifice, loss, and survival. As I walked into the sprawling cathedral, the whispers began immediately. The room was packed with the city's elite, most of whom looked at my uniform as if I had shown up in a Halloween costume. Beatrice stood near the front, draped in black silk, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Gregory was beside her, shaking hands and practically passing out business cards over my father's casket. When Beatrice saw me, her lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. She broke away from a group of local politicians and glided over, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You couldn't even dress appropriately for Dad's funeral?" she murmured, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You just had to wear the uniform, didn't you, Sloane?" Always desperate for attention, it's a bit late to play the dutiful daughter. I looked at my sister, taking in the sheer superficiality of her grief. I had interrogated hardened insurgents who possessed more genuine emotion. "I came straight from a deployment, Beatrice," I replied evenly, my voice steady. "This is the most formal attire I own." "Right," she scoffed, her eyes raking over my medals with utter dismissiveness. "Your little deployment. Well, try not to embarrass us today." The mayor is here." I stood at the back of the cathedral for the rest of the service. I didn't shed a tear. I mourned the father I wished I had, rather than the cold, unyielding businessman lying in the mahogany box. I felt entirely out of place, an alien in a world of champagne problems and corporate greed. My real family, the men and women I served with, who would take a bullet for me without a second thought, were thousands of miles away. Little did I know, they were a lot closer than I thought. The reading of the will took place 2 days later at the Thomas family estate. The atmosphere in the grand library was thick with anticipation. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and Arthur's signature cigars. Rain lashed against the towering bay windows, casting gray, dreary light across the shelves of unread classic literature. Charles Whitmore, my father's longtime attorney, sat at the head of the massive oak table. He was a nervous, sweating man who had spent 3 decades bending to Arthur's every whim. He shuffled through a thick stack of legal documents, periodically adjusting his spectacles and clearing his throat. Beatrice and Gregory sat on a plush velvet sofa opposite him. They looked like royalty awaiting their coronation. Beatrice was already tapping away on a tablet, likely looking at properties or yacht catalogs. I sat alone on a stiff-backed wooden chair in the corner, still wearing my uniform, my posture rigidly straight. I hadn't come for the money. I had long accepted that I wouldn't see a dime of the Thomas fortune, but I was legally required to be present. "Let us begin," Whitmore finally said, his voice trembling slightly as he broke the silence. The reading was agonizingly slow. Arthur had an estate valued at over $80 million, not including the commercial real estate holdings, offshore accounts, and the shipping company itself. Whitmore droned on for nearly an hour, listing off assets and assigning them. The primary estate, the stock portfolios, the penthouse in New York, the controlling shares of Thomas Real Estate. Every single asset, every trust fund, and every corporate title was handed directly to Beatrice and her husband. Gregory's chest puffed out further with every passing sentence, while Beatrice simply nodded, her smugness radiating across the room. Finally, Whitmore reached the last page of the document. He paused, his face flushing violently. He looked up at me, then down at the paper, swallowing hard. "And to my youngest daughter, Sloane," Whitmore read, his voice dropping to a hesitant whisper. He tugged at his collar. The deceased has left a specific clause." "Read it, Charles," Beatrice snapped, leaning forward with a predatory glint in her eyes, exactly as he wrote it. Whitmore wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "To my youngest daughter, Sloane, who defied my wishes, abandoned her family's legacy, and chose a life of muddy mediocrity over the Thomas name, I leave the sum of $1 single dollar." The room fell dead silent. Whitmore wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, reading faster now, eager to get it over with. "It is my final request that she cease embarrassing this name with her low-level government employment, and that she be permanently barred from setting foot on any property owned by the Thomas estate. She is no daughter of mine." The cruelty of the words hung in the air like a toxic gas. It wasn't just disinheritance. It was a calculated, vicious strike from beyond the grave. Arthur had weaponized his dying words to deliver one final, public humiliation. He wanted to make sure I knew exactly how little he thought of my life, my service, and my sacrifices. Beatrice let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold, brittle sound. "Well," Beatrice said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. She looked down at me as if I were a piece of dirt she had just scraped off her shoe. "I suppose you're used to living on a meager government salary anyway. You'll be fine. But as per father's wishes, you are trespassing." Gregory stood up beside her, crossing his arms. "You heard the will, Sloane. We are putting this estate on the market next week. You have exactly 1 hour to get your things out of the guest room. I don't want your combat boots tracking dirt on the Persian rugs anymore." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My military training had taught me how to compartmentalize pain and maintain bearing in the face of hostility. I stood up slowly, ensuring my uniform was perfectly aligned, and looked my sister dead in the eyes. "Keep the money, Beatrice," I said quietly, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's the only thing that will ever love you back." I turned on my heel and walked out of the library, ignoring her outraged gasp. I climbed the grand sweeping staircase to the guest bedroom. My belongings were sparse, just a standard-issue green canvas duffel bag and a garment bag. I began to methodically fold my few civilian clothes, the mechanical routine grounding me. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a profound sense of isolation. My father hated me. My sister despised me. I was entirely alone. As I zipped up my duffel bag, a strange sound broke through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. It started as a low, mechanical rumble, a deep vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old mansion. Then came the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires tearing up the pristine, million-dollar gravel driveway. It wasn't the smooth purr of a luxury sedan. It was the aggressive roar of high-output engines. Downstairs, I heard the front door yanked open, and Beatrice screaming, "Who do you think you are? You can't bring those vehicles in here. Gregory, call the police." I walked over to the second-story window and pushed aside the heavy velvet drapes. My breath caught in my throat. 3 massive, unmarked black Chevy Tahoes had smashed straight through the estate's wrought iron security gates, completely ignoring the keypad access. They were parked haphazardly across Beatrice's beloved manicured front lawn, their heavy tires sinking deep into the mud and tearing up the expensive turf. The doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect, terrifying unison. Men began stepping out into the pouring rain. They weren't wearing police uniforms, and they certainly weren't local security. They wore tactical civilian clothing, cargo pants, moisture-wicking shirts, heavy plate carriers, and drop-leg holsters. They carried short-barreled rifles slung tight against their chests. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that sent a shiver of absolute recognition down my spine. I knew these men. I knew the way they moved, the way they scanned the perimeter, the silent communication passing between them. These weren't bodyguards. This was an operational detachment from Delta Force. Leading them was a massive man with a thick, rain-soaked beard and eyes as cold as a winter storm. Master Sergeant Draco Porter. We had run 5 operations together in the most dangerous corners of the globe. He was a man who had faced down heavily armed insurgents without blinking, and he looked absolutely furious. I cracked the window open just in time to hear Gregory rushing out onto the porch, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of authority. "Listen here," Gregory shouted, waving his arms. "This is private property. You are trespassing on the Thomas estate, and I demand you leave before I have you arrested." Master Sergeant Porter didn't even slow his stride. He walked straight up the marble steps, his heavy combat boots tracking mud and gravel across the pristine porch, and stopped inches from Gregory's face. Gregory immediately shrank back, all his corporate bravado evaporating in the face of a man who dealt in actual violence. "We don't care about your property," Porter's voice boomed over the sound of the rain, hard and carrying an unmistakable edge of lethal authority. "We are looking for Major Sloane Thomas." Rain poured relentlessly over the chaotic scene on the front lawn, washing away the pristine facade of the Thomas estate. Gregory stood paralyzed on the sweeping marble portico, his face entirely drained of color. He had spent his entire adult life intimidating junior executives, leveraging wealth, and threatening devastating lawsuits from the safety of a climate-controlled boardroom. Now, facing a battle-hardened Tier 1 operator who looked perfectly capable of snapping his neck without a second thought, Gregory's corporate armor shattered into millions of pathetic pieces. Beatrice, unable to comprehend a world where her authority wasn't immediately recognized, marched out onto the terrace. She held her designer silk shawl over her head to shield her hair from the downpour, her eyes flashing with indignant fury. "Who exactly do you think you are speaking to?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice shrill and grating over the rumbling, idling engines of the 3 black Tahoes. "I am Beatrice Crawford, and I own this estate. My husband just told you to leave." "If you are looking for Sloane, she is nothing but a low-level paper pusher in the army, and she has already been ordered to vacate the premises. Now get off my grass before I ruin you." Master Sergeant Draco Porter slowly turned his head. He didn't yell, he didn't posture, he simply leveled a gaze at my sister that was entirely devoid of human warmth. It was the clinical, calculating look of a predator assessing a particularly annoying but harmless insect. "Ma'am," Porter said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the sound of the storm, I highly suggest you step back and remain silent. You are interfering with official business of the United States Joint Special Operations Command. One more word, and I will have my men detain you for obstructing a federal military operation." Beatrice's jaw dropped. For the first time in her pampered, sheltered existence, her money and her name meant absolutely nothing. Hearing the commotion, I grabbed my green canvas duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and made my way down the grand staircase. The heavy oak doors of the foyer were already thrown wide open. 4 more Delta operators had advanced up the steps, their weapons lowered but their situational awareness dialed to the absolute maximum. They were scanning the perimeter, treating the millionaire's mansion exactly as they would a hostile extraction zone in a foreign theater. When my boots hit the marble floor of the foyer, the entire dynamic of the room shifted instantly. Master Sergeant Porter caught sight of me. Immediately, his aggressive, intimidating posture vanished, replaced by an ironclad display of profound military respect. He snapped to attention, and in perfect unison, every single heavily armed operator on the porch followed suit. "Major Thomas," Porter barked, his voice echoing through the cavernous foyer. "Stand down, Master Sergeant," I replied, my voice calm and authoritative, as I walked out onto the portico to join them. I completely ignored Gregory, who was now pressing himself against one of the massive stone pillars, as if trying to merge with the masonry. "What is the situation? Why is JSOC kicking down the doors of my late father's house?" "Apologies for the dramatic entrance, ma'am," Porter said, stepping forward and handing me a waterproof tablet. "Your encrypted satellite phone was dark. Pentagon flagged an imminent crisis 20 minutes ago. The HVT we've been tracking in the Damascus sector just went active. Command says they need your tactical oversight on the extraction immediately. The president authorized a raid, but the ground commanders refused to step off without you in the command center. General Roberts sent us to come pull you out." Beatrice stood completely frozen, the silk shawl slipping from her head and falling into a muddy puddle at her feet. She stared at me, then at the heavily armed men, treating me with absolute reverence, her mind desperately trying to process the impossibility of the scene. "HVT? Command center?" Beatrice stammered, her voice shaking violently. "Sloan, what is he talking about? You're just a clerk. You file paperwork." I slowly turned to look at my older sister. The sheer arrogance that had defined her entire life was rapidly dissolving into profound, suffocating confusion. "I am a military intelligence officer attached to the most elite counterterrorism units on the planet, Beatrice," I said coldly, locking eyes with her. "I don't file paperwork, I hunt monsters. And frankly, the people I interrogate on a daily basis have far more honor than anyone sitting in that library today." Gregory finally found a fraction of his voice, though it sounded like a pathetic squeak. You command these men?" Master Sergeant Porter let out a short, humorless scoff. "Command us? Major Thomas is the only reason half of my team is still breathing. She coordinated the air support that pulled us out of a catastrophic ambush in Kabul 3 years ago. We don't just take orders from her, pal. We trust her with our lives. Something a coward like you couldn't possibly understand." I handed the tablet back to Porter. The operational details were clear. It was a time-sensitive strike, and every second we wasted arguing with Chicago's elite was a second the target had to slip away into the shadows. "Are the birds spinning up at the airfield?" I asked Porter, entirely shifting into operational mode. "Yes, Major. A C-17 is fueled and waiting on the tarmac. We can have you airborne and connected to the Pentagon Secure Network in 25 minutes. "Let's move out," I commanded. "Wait!" Beatrice screamed, suddenly lunging forward, her perfectly manicured hands desperately grabbing at the sleeve of my uniform. "You can't just leave! We have legal matters to settle. The will, the estate, the press." I violently yanked my arm away from her grasp. Porter instantly stepped between us, his massive frame forming an impenetrable wall of Kevlar and muscle. Beatrice stumbled backward, her eyes wide with fear as Porter's hand rested casually near his holstered sidearm. "Do not touch the Major again," Porter warned quietly. I looked at my sister, watching the rain ruin her expensive designer dress, ruining the perfect, curated image she tried so hard to project to the world. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt absolutely nothing. The will has been settled, Beatrice, I said, my voice completely flat. Father left me $1 and he barred me from his empire. I have exactly what I came for. The rest of this pathetic kingdom belongs entirely to you. Porter hesitated for a fraction of a second, tapping the side of his communications earpiece. He looked at me, a grim, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Actually, Major, Porter said, raising his voice just enough so that Beatrice and Gregory could hear every single damning word. We received a secondary flash message from the FBI field office in Chicago while we were en route to this location. It pertains directly to the Thomas real estate and shipping empire. Gregory's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly darting back and forth in sheer panic. The FBI? What does the FBI want with our company? Porter pulled a thick, sealed manila folder from one of the cargo pockets on his tactical vest. He didn't hand it to Gregory, he handed it directly to me. I broke the seal and scanned the top page. It was a heavily redacted intelligence brief, but the key details were painfully clear. It seems, I began, looking up from the dossier and staring dead into Gregory's terrified eyes, that for the last 5 years, Arthur Thomas has been leasing his international shipping containers to a series of shell companies based out of Eastern Europe. Companies that JSOC has conclusively linked to an international arms smuggling syndicate. Beatrice gasped, clapping her hands over her mouth. That's a lie, Gregory shouted, though the sweat pouring down his face betrayed his guilt. We run a legitimate enterprise. We are a cornerstone of the Chicago economy. You're a money launderer, Gregory, I stated coldly, dropping the dossier onto the wet patio table next to him. And apparently, a remarkably sloppy one. Federal investigators have been building a RICO case against this family for 3 years. They were waiting for Arthur to pass before they dropped the hammer on the entire corporate structure. The pieces suddenly fell perfectly into place. It was a twist of fate so profound, it left me momentarily breathless. Arthur Thomas hadn't just disinherited me out of spite. He knew the federal indictments were coming. He knew his empire was built on illegal blood money and that the government was quietly preparing to seize every single asset, freeze every bank account, and arrest the entire board of directors. By legally excising me from the will, cutting me out of the trusts, and publicly disowning me as a low-level bureaucrat, my father had inadvertently done the one thing he never intended to do. He had saved my career. Because I possessed zero financial ties to the Thomas empire, and because I had been legally banished from the properties, my top-secret security clearance remained completely untouched. If Arthur had left me even a single % of the company stock, my clearance would have been instantly revoked, pending a federal investigation, ruining my life's work and my standing in the military. His final act of profound, venomous cruelty had provided me with an ironclad, indisputable legal alibi. They're seizing everything, Beatrice, I said, watching the horrifying reality wash over my sister's face. The accounts, the penthouse, the country club memberships, everything you value is gone. And because Gregory is now legally the primary inheritor and acting CEO, he's the one who is going to take the federal prison sentence. Right on cue, the wail of sirens pierced through the sound of the rainstorm. Down at the bottom of the long, winding driveway, a convoy of dark gray sedans and armored police vehicles smashed through the remnants of the front gates. Red and blue emergency lights violently illuminated the gloomy, rain-soaked afternoon. The FBI had arrived to collect their prize. No, Beatrice whimpered, collapsing against the stone pillar, sliding down until she was sitting in a puddle of muddy water. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading. Sloan, please. You have government connections. You know these people. You can fix this. You can protect us. I adjusted the strap of my canvas duffel bag, looking down at the woman who had mocked my service, ridiculed my sacrifices, and laughed when our father left me a single dollar. I don't protect treasonous criminals, I replied softly. I destroy them. I turned my back on the Thomas estate for the last time. Master Sergeant Porter and the Delta operators formed a tight, protective diamond formation around me as we walked out into the pouring rain. We climbed into the massive black Tahoes just as the first wave of FBI agents rushed up the driveway, shouting orders and drawing their weapons on a sobbing, terrified Gregory. The heavy doors of the SUV slammed shut, cutting off the sounds of Beatrice's hysterical screaming. The tactical vehicles roared to life, reversing aggressively over the ruined landscaping before accelerating down the driveway, effortlessly slipping past the incoming federal raid. Inside the Tahoe, it was warm and quiet. The smell of wet tactical gear and stale coffee filled the cabin. Porter sat in the front passenger seat, turning back to look at me as the driver navigated us away from the burning wreckage of my family's legacy. "Everything all right back there, Major?" Porter asked quietly. I looked out the heavily tinted window, watching the city of Chicago blur past. I thought about the dollar my father had left me. I thought about the empire built on lies that was currently crumbling to the ground. And then I thought about the mission ahead, the men waiting for me, and the true family I had forged in the fire of combat. "Everything is perfectly fine, Master Sergeant," I said, pulling out my encrypted tablet and bringing up the satellite feeds for the Damascus operation. "Get me a line to the Pentagon. We have a war to win." Did this intense story of military justice and family betrayal keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching arrogance get completely dismantled by true heroes, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life dramatic stories. Your support helps us bring more incredible tales of loyalty, shocking twists, and redemption straight to your screen. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment,